So everyone's telling you, you should learn to squat. You should squat more. And maybe you're getting advice from powerlifters on form and Olympic weightlifters, and you just don't know what to do or what's right. Well, I'm here for you. This video, top 6 tips to help you do the squat perfectly. It's coming up. In this video, I'm going to be covering the basics of the squat. So I'm not going to be going into sumo squats. I'm not going to be going into jump squats. I'm not going to be going into single leg squats. This is just the basic squat form and the 6 most important things that you should know before trying it. To summarize, we'll cover the form tips, starting with your feet and ankles, going to your knees, going to your hips, going to your back and your shoulders and head. And last but not least, we're going to cover the question of weight. What should I do? Starting with number 1, your feet and ankles. These are so important, and that's why I'm starting with them. We've got special foot muscles called intrinsic foot muscles, and those are really important for the arches of your feet. Now, why does that matter with the squat, you might be asking? It's because the power and the support comes from the arches of your feet, and it can help with your posture all along the way for the squat. So really important before you start going into squatting, especially squatting with weight, to make sure that you've got a good foundation. Make sure your feet have strong arches. Work on them. If you have too high of an arch, then work on suppressing that arch. But basically, we're going to work on mobility of the ankle and make sure you've got a nice, stable foundation. So let's say you've got a nice, stable foundation. You worked on your ankle mobility to help prevent injuries. Now what do? What's the placement? Now that we're getting into the actual squat. There's a lot of different people that say, okay, stand hip width apart. Okay, stand shoulder width apart. Okay, stand slightly wider than your hips. It all really depends on your body and what type of squat you're doing. But for the basic squat, the general rule of thumb, if you're just getting started, is to try to go about hip width apart for your legs. If that feels exceptionally uncomfortable for you, or you find that you can't track your knees properly over your toes, you can of course adjust your base. It's just a general recommendation, hip width apart. You might also be asking, what about my toes? I hear people say my toes should be pointing forward, and then someone else says they should be pointing out to the side slightly. It really does depend on your body. Typically, if you have much longer legs, you might end up benefiting with slightly pronating the feet. But I would suggest trying first, especially if you're a beginner, to keep your toes facing forwards, just because you want to make sure that you strengthen the right muscle groups to help support around the knee. So now that I've covered the feet and ankles, the importance of the stability in your foot and the ankle mobility, as well as the position of your feet and the orientation of your toes, let's move on to the next one. The next tip is the placement and the movement of your knees. Now, something with the knees that people say is that your knees should track over the 2nd and 3rd toes. That is definitely a great starting point for a beginner. I do recommend that. As you move up towards powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, that could change depending on your body. But for a beginner, I generally recommend 2nd and 3rd toes, target with your knee over them. Now, as a beginner, very important, make sure your knees don't extend too far over your toes. As a general recommendation, your knees should never go 2 inches past your toes. Again, this is for beginners, not for powerlifters or Olympic weightlifters. This is for beginners getting started. General rule of thumb as far as tracking your knees over the 2nd and 3rd toes. Why do we do this? Why don't we shoot for the big toe? Why don't we shoot for the knees going towards the outer sides of the toes? Well, if you cave your knees in other words, your knees are going in towards your big toes or beyond, that can cause what's called knee valgus, which is knock-knee posture. And that's gonna put a lot of stress, not only on your knee, but it's also gonna twist your hip. It's gonna internally rotate your hip, and it's gonna put a lot of strain on your hip, causing possible hip pain. And then you're also going to have more of a tendency to round your lower back when doing so. What about the other way? What if I go bow-legged? Well, if you go bow-legged, you do put a degree of twist, just like making your knees knock-kneed on your tibia, which can twist some ligaments on the inside of your knee, such as the ACL. So very important general rule of thumb, track your knees over the 2nd and 3rd toes, especially if you are a beginner. Moving on to number 3, the hips. What should our hips be doing during this? Ideally, they should be helping us drive backwards as we're going down. Now, a common mistake that people make, especially beginners, is that they're trying to force the squat by moving their knees. They're focusing their attention and energy on their knees, rightfully so if they're focused on making sure that they're tracking their knees over their second and third toes, but they put the pressure and the center of gravity towards the knee joint. In reality, what you should be doing is you should be leading with your hips as you go down. This will help with the proper alignment of the spine as well. Another rule of thumb with the hips is make sure you know which way your pelvis is tilted. You want to make sure that you're not excessively tilting the pelvis forward, and you definitely want to make sure you're not excessively rounding the pelvis backwards. The reason I emphasize the second one is just because it's really common for people to do. There's no one better than the other, anterior pelvic tilt or posterior. It's just that posterior pelvic tilt or rounding the lower back and tucking the tail is very common with people in a squat. It's often referred to as a butt wink, and this can put a lot of strain on the back, and it can lead to some injury and definitely some soreness. All right, so now that we covered the hips, the movement of the hips, and also the orientation of the pelvis, let's move on to the next one. Tip number 4, your back. Now, what is a natural curve of the spine? Basically, we have a concave curve at our neck. We've got a convex curve in our upper back, another concave curve in our lower back, and lastly, a convex curve in our tailbone. So we want to make sure that we try to maintain that in the squat movement. That can be confusing for people because they might say, wait, how far forward do I lean though? Am I supposed to stay completely upright? That depends. Depends on the length of your torso in relation to your leg length and limb length. That's something that sometimes people don't mention. If you've got a longer body, you may end up tilting forward a bit more, and it may be a lot harder for you to tilt further back. But in general, no matter what you do and what movements you do, check in the mirror, record yourself, whatever you need to do to make sure that your spine is in neutral alignment. To help us with this, it's very important that we engage our local core stabilizer muscles. In other words, the transverse abdominis, which is a very important muscle in our core, and the multifidus, which is important in posture or holding up our spine. If you have issues activating these muscles, isometric hold exercises such as plank holds can be super helpful in helping activate and strengthen these muscle groups. One other muscle that could be really important in helping keep you upright is the quadratus lumborum. Now, for some people, this muscle's too tight, so it's very important that you know your own body. But for others, especially those who have a butt wink or a tendency for a tail tuck, the quadratus lumborum can definitely help you straighten up. Moving on to tip number 5, your shoulders and your neck and head, the upper half. Very, 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 very important that you do not round your shoulders down and forward. I can't stress this enough. You need to be able to roll your shoulders down and back and engage that middle back. This is, of course, going to help maintain that neutral spinal curve. Really important also, though, is what you choose to do with your neck or where you choose to look. Sometimes people will stay looking and they'll jut their head forward, or they'll feel like they need to tilt their chin up. It is recommended, especially as a beginner, that you gently tuck your chin down and back slightly. You don't want to be jutting your head forward. If you do happen to shoot your neck forward, you might end up finding that you have severe neck pain afterwards and possibly even a headache. For some of you that might find it difficult to pull your shoulders down and back, it could be because your chest is excessively tight. I do recommend chest stretches. Very important to maintain mobility. All right, last but not least, tip number 6, weights. What should I do? As a beginner, I cannot stress this enough. Do not start with weights. Just work on form. Master it. Here's some ways that you can work on form and master it. Start with a ball and put yourself up against a wall and do wall ball squats. This is going to help you maintain that right movement and slowly learn the correct form. Just make sure when you're doing a wall sit, you don't cheat. Make sure your femur or your thigh bone is about parallel to the ground. If you can go lower, that's okay, but I definitely recommend parallel with the ground. Speaking of depth, I think this is a good time to mention, how deep should I squat? Well, only go as low as you can without compensating form. The great thing is with wall sits is that you can go low and not compensate form. Same thing with the ball squats against the wall. You can't really compensate for form necessarily. First and foremost, always focus on what your body is doing, or what we call the kinetic checkpoints. Your feet, your knees, your hips, your shoulders, your back, your head and neck. Focus on what those are doing, make sure they're in proper neutral alignment. Okay, so maybe you've got this and you watch through and you say, okay, I do all that. I do that correctly. I've done all this correctly. And I've even done wall sits and I've done the ball squats. And that's why I'm here. I'm trying to figure out how to do a squat with weight. Well, if you're starting off with weight, I definitely recommend dumbbells over a barbell. The reason I recommend dumbbells first is because you have more free range of motion with your arms. So that way you can make sure that you practice that form even more, just with a little bit of added weight. If you do decide to evolve to a barbell squat, which is an excellent exercise, bear in mind that for some people, their shoulder mobility may prevent them from proper alignment of the barbell on their shoulders. A lot of times people place the barbell right at the nape of their neck and they are going to hurt themselves significantly. This isn't even proper high bar placement. There's something called high bar placement where it's relatively at the top and sitting on your upper trapezius, but that's for people that are more experienced weightlifters, generally speaking. If you are trying to do a barbell squat, I do recommend doing it with just the barbell first with no weight, but try to go for a low bar placement. This is gonna require more shoulder mobility, but it is going to help keep your shoulders open and your chest open. The low barbell placement should go underneath of the posterior deltoid, or in other words, in line with your shoulder blades. For a lot of people, this shoulder mobility is going to be very difficult. If that's the case, definitely just do it with dumbbells. There is nothing wrong with that. It is much better to focus on form than anything else. If you do find that you still want to do the barbell squat, but you do have limited range of motion in your shoulders and you just don't want to do dumbbells for whatever reason, the front squat is okay. It just will put more of the emphasis on your quads. Oh, and one more bonus tip, specifically for women, because I have women asking me, hey, is there something I should know that's different from me than a man about doing squats? There actually is one minor thing, and it depends on your body type. Some women have wider set hips, and that puts them more inclined to having issues with knee valgus or knock-knee posture. So if that's the case, bear in mind that you may have more of an issue with your knees dropping inwards. If that's the case, make sure you're stretching your adductors and you're strengthening your hip abductors. And of course, you're making sure that your foot and ankle complex is strong and mobile. All right, there you have it. 6 tips for beginners and a bonus tip. If you found this video helpful, I attached a few others that you can go ahead and click on at your leisure, save them for later, whatever you want to do. Go ahead and like, subscribe, and comment below. If you have any suggestions, questions, or comments, I'd love to hear.